happened in this process of doing the new statue that was exciting was we took what was probably the expected approach when we contacted a sculptor and said, we want an identical replica to what was done in 1907. That's a logical response. The community expects it to be replaced. We want it replaced. Well, the sculptor said, we do things a little bit differently than they did in 1907, and we can make this a lot better. And the level of detail and almost emotion that you can see in the sculpture statue is fantastic. So I'm glad we gave them the lead to do something a little bit different. It still honors the entire spirit of the original statue, but it's actually better.
There should be no white gloves treatment for the cemetery juvenile vandals. No restorative justice easy way out. Here's the solution. First, the parents must pay for all the damage done to all the tombstones. Second, these vandals should maintain the cemetery grounds on their school breaks and vacations. And number 3 years probation for all. That would send the right message, rather than juveniles boasting about what they did.
Eyes on Longmont, offering a diversity of topics about our community that will inform and entertain you. We invite you to sit back and enjoy this edition of Eyes on Longmont.
What happened to the cemetery in August of 2013 was that over 100 gravestones were tipped over, and we also had a Civil War statue that had been given to the cemetery in the early 1900s, tipped over and broken into many pieces. And I got a call from the office manager, the manager of the cemetery that morning, and she said, I hate to tell you this, but there's been a massive vandalism at the cemetery, and we're trying to deal with it. Well, I think the initial reaction was just some anger. I was a little bit afraid about, not like a fear of personal safety, but just a little bit afraid about what I was going to find when I went out there. The cemetery manager told me that my family headstone had been tipped over as well. My family came to Longmont in 1901. They came to Colorado in the 1800s and started a grocery and bakery store, and then later got into real estate and insurance. So starting with my great-grandfather, most of my family with the last name Dworak has been buried at the cemetery. And the manager was shaken. She was upset, and we walked around the cemetery and looked at the damage and looked at the damage to my stone, our stone, and it was upsetting.
Our community is not unlike any other community. We tend to define justice as a pound of flesh or an eye for an eye. And when you see people stand up and say they want justice, they're talking about retribution. They're talking about being punitive. They're talking about sending people to jail and really punishing somebody. What we have seen in our community, because the Longmont Community Justice Partnership is very much a community-based process, I'm going to guess there have been, I'm just going to say, thousands of people from our community who have been volunteers over the years and have been exposed to the restorative justice process in some form or fashion, either as a facilitator, a community member, or perhaps even been an offender or a victim of a crime, or just, and so all of those have been people who have been involved in our community, and so we've had thousands of people. And I think I can almost safely say that the impact has been that they're now seeing, they would now probably define justice a lot differently. And it wouldn't be as punitive, it wouldn't be as retributive, and they would begin, they're beginning to see that we can find more effective solutions with other ways of doing business outside of the criminal justice system.
So what is justice? That's the question that you come across. What is justice? To me, justice is what the offended person feels has been done right, what has been done to fix what's been done to them. In the criminal justice system, just because someone's found guilty, is given a fine, community service, or jail time or prison, if the affected person doesn't feel as though their issue has been fixed, is that justice? That's the thing about restorative justice. Justice comes about only when everyone in that circle sits and comes to an agreement on the contract.
Are they going to be the same?
If the victim sitting in that circle says, you know what, I don't feel like this contract restores the harms that was created, then the contract's not done. Then the referred person has to figure out what they need to do to fix it or to create justice with the person that they offended. That's really the difference in justice when it comes to the criminal justice system, or RJ.
It isn't about what law did you break, and the police officers now in Longmont and some other communities around the United States, they have another option. They might ask that person, well, Henry, you look like you're willing to take responsibility for your actions, so would you be willing to go through this program where you have to be accountable and say, I've done this, I'm sorry. You have to go through a process where you understand whom you've harmed. The offender goes through a circle, and the circle is comprised of victim or victims, support people for the offender or offenders. There will typically be a police officer there. If it's a juvenile, we will typically have community members from the school or just young people in general, as well as adults. And everybody sits in a circle, and the person tells the story. You know, would you please explain to everybody, Henry, what you did? What were you thinking at the time? Why did you do it? Who do you think was affected and how, right? And we go through this process, and then everybody gets a chance to speak. And they speak from their own perspectives as to what this incident meant to them. How was the community harmed? How was the police officer affected? How was the mom or dad or aunt or grandma affected when they did this? Yeah. We go through a brainstorming exercise where people start to identify possible repairs to the harms, to the offense. You know, how do we make this right? And at the end, a contract is written up, typically 3 to 5 items that everybody has agreed, including the offender, that I want to do this, I'm willing to do this because it'll make things right. And if the person completes their contract over whatever span of time that is, and it's typically 3 or 4 months, there's no record, there's no police record of this incident anymore. And this person hopefully has, you know, learned their lesson. They've maybe done some community service. They've maybe written apology letters. They've done some other things that start to maybe repair the harms to the relationships that exist, because the sort of the premise of restorative justice is relationships. If you have a relationship that's important, whether it's a spouse or a family or a school or a work environment, then if that's truly important, it's important to keep it whole. And that's what we attempt to do.
We can use restorative practices and the principles associated with those practices in any environment. We've used them in our workplace. I've used them in a disciplinary case. And instead of just punishing somebody with a day off or a letter of reprimand, we actually brought the people that were harmed and the people who did the harm into the same room and ran a conference, and it worked beautifully. We actually used it in conflict resolution between two departments in public safety, and we used a restorative process to find common ground and to address the concerns that were there. And so restorative communities is just a giant expansion. Workplaces, churches, families, neighborhoods, the criminal justice system. If it can be used in a criminal justice system between someone who's committed a crime and someone who's been victimized by a crime, frankly, I think it can be used anywhere. And so the idea of a restorative community is not far-fetched at all.
I've been very excited over the last few years about the development of restorative justice and the encouragement from the legislature and others in Colorado that offices like mine get involved with restorative justice, because there's things that can be done with restorative justice that you cannot do through the traditional criminal justice system. You can take cases out of the very formal adjudication that we have for serious crimes, and it's a system that was designed and works quite well with serious criminal behavior. But when you put low-level cases through it, it takes a long time, it's expensive, and it reaches results that are often very formalistic and that leave both victims and defendants with a feeling of kind of lack of resolution. What is my goal as district attorney? My goal as district attorney is to keep the community safe. That does mean with certain cases and certain very serious cases, we need to basically take dangerous people and lock them away where they can't hurt anybody. But that's not most cases, and it's only a handful of juvenile cases. The rest of the time, what we're trying to do is hold people accountable and heal the harm.
As far as what I expect to happen with restorative justice, I'm really hoping that these kids are put on a good path for the rest of their lives, that this is something that they might wake up in the middle of the night and clench their teeth about, but at least they know, okay, I'm better now than I was then. And you know, I've got 3 kids. I've got kids older than these kids here, and so it's, you know, I'm sensitive to the challenges of the parents. I'm sensitive to the dumb things that kids do. I've seen it, I've done it myself, and I've learned from it, and I hope these kids do as well. I'll admit to nervousness in it. I don't know how it's going to work. I think it's going to be hard. I feel some burden in trying to make this work for the community and then also for these kids. As far as the kids themselves, again, having been a kid and also with my kids, if you're too heavy-handed with them, they are going to just pull in immediately and you're not going to get anywhere. So walking that balance and also thinking about the work that we have to do, it's a little bit daunting, but I think it's the right thing to do.
I was unfamiliar with the restorative justice program until my son was referred to the program by a police officer. He and his friend were caught doing something they shouldn't have been doing, and he was referred to the program. It was new to us at that time. I was not, as I said, familiar with it before that. And he and I went through the process together. We went to the pre-conference together, and we participated in the process in the circle together. And both of us left just very, very impressed with the process and the whole program. And certainly the most important thing to us was that it kept him out of the whole court system. It was a fairly minor infraction, but certainly something that he should not have been doing. And he was made well aware of the consequences of his actions, and we were just both believers from that point on. One of the things that I appreciated so much about the Restorative Justice program was its reflection on the community, and the fact that it really showed us, especially those of, we were newcomers to the community, that this is a caring community, that in fact they do care about keeping kids out of the court system, and they do care what happens to these kids and trying to get them on the right track, getting them to acknowledge and taking responsibility, and doing something that's not necessarily punitive, but certainly something that's going to teach them a lesson, so to speak, and as I said, the repercussions of what they did. And that extended all the way from the volunteers who are involved administratively with the program, to those that are community members who give their time, to the police officers who are involved. It's really a community endeavor.
Huge difference between the school-based RJ program and the criminal justice system is these are kids dealing with kids. In the criminal justice system, it's an adult that represents them. It's an adult that determines if they're guilty or innocent. It's an adult that hands down the punishment. In the school-based program, these are their peers, the people they look up to, that sit there and are listening to them and are working with them and letting them know the harms that they did, and also letting them know that they can fix it and bring them back into the community. The peer-based program for working with kids is huge. It's no longer an adult punishing me, an adult telling me what to do. It's my peers helping me and working with me to fix what I've done and welcoming me back into my close community.
It was me and my friends, and we were messing around getting each other's information for Facebook, and eventually we kind of took it too far and we started trying to be mean to each other and saying texting people over Facebook and saying oh, we're not friends anymore, blah blah blah, and saying a couple derogatory terms. And eventually one of my friend's moms actually called the school because one of my friends were threatened, I guess you would call it, to get beaten up.
One of his close friends had gained access to his password, and two of the boys, or one of the boys used Peter's name and password login information, and so they would use Peter's identity to post some really terrible things. The victim was a young girl. She was a freshman also. They were all brand new freshmen. These boys, including my son, needed guidance through this. It was traumatic for the girl. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure, it was traumatic for each and every kid. I felt it was imperative, regardless if Peter was also the harm party, he also needed to see exactly how much ramifications were involved and how deep the emotional distress was for each of the people, especially the victim, and he was emotionally distressed.
I didn't really even like this girl. The whole problem was the kid that did like her just got really jealous and mad from what I did through somebody else's Facebook, and then he came back and he did it through the same Facebook page. They used my name, so I see her around a lot, but it's not something that I'm afraid of every day. It feels really comfortable and nice, and it feels like the stuff between us have been resolved and that we can be around school and around each other, work together if we have to on a project.
Restorative process really falls into three questions. What happened, who was affected, and what needs to be done to make it right. And if you look into a classroom or any situation, those three questions fit. If someone was harmed, what happened? Who was responsible for it? What can you take responsibility for? And most of the time, in a conflict of a relationship, both sides can take responsibility for something. And then what needs to be done to fix it so that you guys can be in good standing again? And that's the restorative language. We look at it when there's a crime, and we call that restorative circle. We look at it when there's disrespect in a classroom. That's restorative language, restorative process in the classroom. We look at it mediation. it can be used so many different ways. It doesn't just have to be a law violation or a rule violation, especially if there's a relationship involved.
When I was trained by Officer Maltrud, it was a weird experience, as I never thought I'd be in like presence of a cop in a good way. I always thought like cops were not to be offensive, but I always thought cops were only there when you were in trouble. So actually getting trained by a cop to do the restorative justice was good, because I saw his point of view on things, and I saw how much he liked this program, and I learned a lot from Officer Maltrud. And when I was being a trainer with Officer Maltrud, I used some of his knowledge that he taught me to teach the other students.
Restorative justice has these 5 R's, they're called. And they're really the precepts around what restorative justice is and why it's important, why do we care. In my mind, it starts with relationship. If there's a relationship that's important, whether it's in a marriage or a community or a workplace, then people are willing to take responsibility, which is the second R, right? Take responsibility for your actions. By doing this, you're having respect for that relationship, and within a community, respect for everybody that's in the community. The idea then is that if those things are important to you, your ultimate goal is to repair the relationship where it's been broken, perhaps, with the idea of ultimately, reintegrating yourself or reintegrating that person or persons back into that relationship so you maintain the wholeness of it. Those are the 5 R's of restorative justice.
I think that there's a real value to the victim as well in this process, and I think that comes at the moment when the victim sees the offender as another person, somebody who has made a wrong choice, a bad choice, a wrong decision that has adversely affected them. And I think once they see that genuine remorse, there's a real healing that takes place for both of them.
As far as my feeling towards these kids, I didn't want to, I remember the morning of, I told my wife, I said, I don't want to go to this. I just want this over. I wish I could just skip it. And, I was very nervous, and I don't know if they could sense that, but they probably could. But I was nervous, and I was uncomfortable being near them and hearing them at first, and being in this big room with a bunch of people. And it was interesting that myself and the cemetery staff, each one of us, and they're hard workers and they deal with death on a daily basis. I'm a trained attorney. I've heard just about everything you could possibly hear in someone's lifetime. We all became emotional, not to a hysterical standpoint, but you could feel that it was an emotional process for each one of us. As far as the reaction when they learned that I was an actual victim, I think the word is ashen. You could see the blood drain from their faces, and their body language just kind of curved back in. I think they were pretty surprised that there'd be an actual victim, if you want to call it, there at the process. The circle, as they call it, was really interesting, and I think it was unusual for restorative justice too, that you had so many people together at the same time. So if you think about it overall, as far as the day's concerned, the first part of the day was them explaining and expressing their remorse and their guilt, and they were more measured and looking down and not making as much eye contact. As we worked through the process and talked more and more, it was a little bit, it sounds strange now, that it was more of a collaboration, that there was more of a discussion about what are going to be the next steps and things like that. So it was much more of an engaging procedure as the day went on. These kids, for lack of a better term, because they're pretty young, they felt really bad about this. You know, they couldn't have faked this. They didn't have the body language of, you know, wasting their day or one more thing they got to do or forced to be there because their dad made them do it, that sort of thing. So, I mean, you could tell that they felt bad about it. After we started the process and got through kind of the initial nervousness, as I said, with them feeling bad and then us expressing our feelings, I did start to believe, start to feel almost empathetic to them about trying to work through their problems, trying to get through this process with them so that they could move on with their lives. And that was a common theme, at least with myself and the cemetery folks, that we wanted to help them to make sure that they didn't ever do this again, that they really learned from this process. And one of the other things that was expressed pretty strongly was that they needed to become not only people that wouldn't do this again, that they would lead by example to others and, you know, make sure that other people don't get into situations like this. And that was really expressed quite a bit throughout this meeting. As far as the way the kids perceived the message, or at least the goals that we were trying to get accomplished, they were engaged. They wanted to do better with their lives. You know, they realized pretty strongly, pretty quickly, that they were given a second chance in being part of this process, and they wanted to do something with that.
During the process, I shared my feelings about the incident that had happened with my son and the consequences that it had caused within the family, and there were certainly repercussions there. I was also very impressed with the community members. I think we tend to think of these incidences as being isolated and really not affecting others. And it was made very clear to both my son and I that his actions, although there was not a quote-unquote victim in this situation, there were repercussions. There were repercussions for the police department. Time was involved in processing the situation with my son, time that could very well have been spent in another situation that the police, you know, perhaps were needed for. This incident took place in a park, and one of the community members brought to our attention that this is a park where she enjoys playing with her kids and certainly doesn't want that kind of activity going on. So it sort of opened both of our eyes to the ripple effect that these things have in the community.
So the uniqueness of a police officer in the circle is we understand the criminal justice system. And we understand what they would probably be facing if they went to court to start with. So we can look at different aspects of the contract. We can look at different aspects of what really would have happened. And I've had cases where there's been people in the circle that have wanted unreasonable amount of community service. And it takes educating them to understand that they wouldn't have got that if they went to court anyways. And it's not reasonable. But I think you got to take it outside of more just looking at it as a police officer, because we're community members, and a lot of the time we're looked up to just because of the position that we're in. And what I know is those that sit in the circle, if they have relevancy to the offender, then they become very powerful in that circle. So as a community member that's in a position of authority, and if I've created any type of rapport with that referred person up to that point, I can carry a lot of weight. I can carry a lot of influence to that person to hopefully get them to understand the ripple effect that they've caused. There was a circle that involved some athletes. And one of the people that sat in the circle was a former college athlete that had won some prestigious awards. And he became very, very relevant to those kids. And with that relevancy became them really starting to take the process seriously and understanding what they've done. Myself, I try to do the same thing. I try to figure out what that connection is I have with them and use that so that they understand what they've done and how that works.
You know, the way our police department determines whether or not a case goes to restorative justice, at some level it's up to the officer. They've been trained, and actually they've been trained by those folks who, from the Longmont Community Justice Partnership, in terms of what kinds of circumstances, what kinds of crimes we would want to refer to the restorative justice process. Now, I will say initially, we started off with a pilot program with the criteria were people under the age of 18, kids, people who had only committed misdemeanors, the less serious crimes, and people who had never been a part of the criminal justice system or arrested prior. So, but after the pilot, we began to refer folks who were adults as well, and we began to refer people who had committed felonies, and we began to refer people who had already been in the criminal justice system. Your resistance to RJ is a fairly common reality that every system, judicial system, district attorney's office, and police department has to come to terms with. We've been fortunate in Boulder County that LCJP has really been a trailblazer. They took one of the largest police departments, the Longmont Police Department, and showed through the Longmont Police Department that restorative justice can work and it can be effective. And one of the most attractive things about restorative justice is that it saves money. You're not incarcerating people, you're moving cases through more quickly, and I can tell you, having talked to other district attorneys who are maybe less philosophically interested in restorative justice than I am, that when you start talking about the impact on your budget and on the number of FTEs you need to process cases and how many days of jail time, which is one of the most expensive things we deal with, people begin to get quite excited about that. And there's always a certain amount of kind of healthy cynicism about changing a system and thinking, are we somehow ignoring what really happened here with criminal behavior? But when people begin to see how it works and also understand restorative justice is not letting anybody off the hook. You're not saying, well, what you did is not a big deal. What you're saying is, it is a big deal, and you need to come to terms with what a big deal it was in a meaningful way, the same way that the victim has had to do. And when people begin to understand that, they actually see that restorative justice is very effective at both holding people accountable, effectively healing the harm that's been done, and saving money to the system across the board.
We thought about general categories. The most basic one that everyone probably thinks of is some form of restitution, that there has to be some money involved. Now, kids are not rich by any stretch, so it had to be an amount that we felt that they could come up with and could do in a reasonable time, but hurt, that somebody just couldn't write a check. So that was a major concern, and that was met. The other aspect was thinking about what they had done to the community, the staff, and the victims, and how could they repay that. And that came out in two areas. The first was apology letters to a variety of different people, including the community, that to say, I know what I've done is wrong and I'm deeply sorry about it. And that was very important to us, although it was interesting the way the public sometimes perceived that. They perceived it as, oh look, they just had to write an apology letter and get off. But no, it was really important to us that they expressed to the community that they recognized they did something really bad. And then the last aspect of was thinking about what this did to the cemetery staff and the workers, and that all the extra work, all the stress of getting everything put back together, that we wanted to have some level of physical activity put back in, to think about the hard work to restore the cemetery, that they would have to repay that in some way. And this took an interesting twist in that it was also expressed by myself and the cemetery staff that we didn't want them at the cemetery. We didn't want them to do work at the cemetery. That bothered us. I mean, we didn't feel comfortable with that. So we worked on other areas where they could do forms of physical labor in the community that would help the community. As far as what the kids had to do physically, as far as their program. If you think about the timing of when this happened, soon after we had the historic floods, and there was and continues to be massive damage in the community. So we really tried, and not everybody did it, and it wasn't a requirement, but we really tried to focus the kids on doing something as it helps the community recover from the floods. And people were pretty excited about that was a good area to focus, because that was an area that the community could appreciate.
As a police officer, we have very few tools in our toolbox to deal with incidences. We carry tools to deal with people. You know, we have our gun, we have our taser, pepper spray. But when it comes down to the incident, before RJ, we had two things. We had an arrest, or we had nothing at all. And what I know, being involved in law enforcement for 16 years, is that there's a lot of cases in the courts that bog the courts down that don't need to be there. And finally, with RJ, we have another tool in our toolbox. So now it's not put him in the criminal justice system or do nothing at all, but we have a third, which is very powerful, especially for your first offenders, to keep them out of the criminal justice system. So they get to learn that when they make a mistake, they can fix it. And then they learn that they can actually come back to that community and be part of that community. It's a tool that's added now to give me the opportunity to look and say, do they need to go to the courts? Because there are those that need to go to court. And if they don't, maybe they got to have consequences, so letting them go isn't an option. Now we have our option.
4 kids basically broke into 50 different cars in our community. The community was outraged. The victims whose cars were broken into were outraged. Many of those folks didn't have insurance. Many of those folks were financially not well off, couldn't fix their car, were very upset. But we were able to talk to them about the possibilities of a restorative justice conference or circle. And all of them accepted that possibility, which was quite rare to have almost 50 people who were victimized by a felony crime, and some unable to fix their car say yes to this. And 3 out of the 4 offenders said yes. And so we had a restorative justice process. And I recall the room when it first started and how the anger was palpable. And the people who had committed the crimes, the kids that had committed the offenses, were scared. And so the conversation began, and the facilitators began to facilitate the conference. And I'm going to make a long story really short here. But by the end of the conference, everyone, there was hardly a dry eye in the room. Everybody was hugging. The people whose cars had been broken into were willing to work with the kids, were willing to mentor the kids, were willing to befriend the kids and their families. And it provided at some level that sense of where the relationship principle just became so alive and well between people, one person who had harmed another. We never saw those kids again. And I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that relationship developed between those folks who had been harmed by their crimes and them. And they became accountable not only to themselves but to them. And the other part of this is that there's people in the community that are not either offender or a victim that were also a very strong voice around what happened, and they also became accountable to them, representatives of the community. And so for us, those forces of the universe hold a lot of power.
Restorative justice first started at Longmont High School. It was, people thought it was weird, like people didn't understand what it was and didn't have like a background of it. And teachers themselves had trouble believing that it would actually work. So they had trouble like referring students to restorative justice. They didn't know like what it would do, like how it would impact the school. So no one knew how this would impact anything. And so when Laura got her first case of restorative justice, everyone was, like administration was like, is this gonna work? Like, what are we dealing with? Like, did we make a right decision? And I remember if I was involved with the case at all. It was quite a while ago, but after that first case, Laura started getting more and more cases. She started getting a bunch. She kept herself very occupied because there's so many cases. And so a lot of teachers started hearing from it, and they started referring more students, because after a while they realized, like, yes, it did help. They had a lot of cases that first year. In the second year, they had less cases. We already had like the 2 pilot schools, like the middle school, it was Sunset and Longs Peak Middle School. And I remember in Sunset, there was a lot of cases the first year. There was a lot of cases. And by the second year, I guess kids learned on their own how to prevent this stuff. And so there wasn't that many cases when I was doing the statistics for it. It was a very low number from Westview.
The restorative justice process has really changed him. It's changed us as a family. I no longer have that fear or that anxiety of, oh my goodness, is Peter making the right choice? I know that along the way he's going to make, some bad choices. We all do, we're human. But I think he has so many skills now that he didn't have before the restorative justice process, that it's not only changed him, but it's changed us as a whole family.
I always like to say that the goal of our juvenile system is to turn these young people into taxpayers. And what I mean by that is we want to get them through school, keep them off drugs and alcohol, and keep them out of prison. And most of the time, if you can get a juvenile that's involved in illegal behavior when they're 14 or 15 to age 22 or 23, with an education, without a drug or alcohol problem, and without time in prison, they're going to be fine. They'll go on, get married, have a family, have a job, and contribute to the community. Well, by keeping somebody out of the system entirely, we are much more likely to be able to do that than by putting them through the system. Because when they go through the system, particularly lower level offenders, what happens? One, they have a record. And even though juvenile records can be sealed, they're still there, and employers often can find out about them, and it can impact a person's ability to move forward. Number 2, an offender going through the system is going to be spending time with other people that may have been involved in much worse criminal behavior than they were, and that can have a socializing effect that can be unhealthy and may encourage them to get involved in gangs or drug dealing or this kind of thing. And then 3, it can have an impact on schooling. So if we can keep a young person engaged in life, moving forward, staying in a good social situation while still taking accountability for what they did and understanding that and paying that back, we're much more likely to turn them in to the taxpayer that's the ultimate goal of the system.
What I consider the failure of the system to keep our community safe. We would arrest or summon somebody, and the recidivism rate for those folks were upwards of 70%. And we did a study at one point in which we looked at 235 people in our city that we arrested for 3 different kinds of felonies. We went back and looked at the history of those folks and found out that on average each of those folks had been arrested 9 times and had 17 charges filed against them. And so frankly, I was ready for something along the lines of restorative justice that we could use as an alternative and at some level a complement to the criminal justice system.
So my experience with restorative justice goes back 15 years. I started out in an agency that didn't have restorative justice. And then 7 years ago, when I came to Longmont, I was introduced to restorative justice. And my first impression was, what's this? Another tree hugging, nothing happens, feel good when you leave. I'm not going to send any good cases here. And then 5 years ago, I became a school resource officer, and I was approached because of this grant. And I was like, I really don't want it in my school. These kids need to know that there's consequences, that there's boundaries, and when they violate those boundaries, that there's going to be consequences. And the consequences is court. And then I started traveling around and doing some research. I was really encouraged to take it on. And when I started getting out there, I started realizing we're not teaching our kids anything in the criminal justice system. And here's an opportunity for us to learn and grow and teach and mold the future. And then I started to realize, wow, this isn't a feel good, because ultimately in court, you never have to admit guilt. Matter of fact, you never have to say anything in court. You hire an attorney that does all your talking for you. You never have to admit that you did anything wrong. And then you just have to do whatever punishment's handed down by an adult. You never have to hear the effects that it's had on the people played. And really, there's only one person usually, one group of people, they call them victims, that you feel is impacted. Where in restorative justice, you have to take a responsibility. Not community service, pay a fine, go to probation and keep one person happy. You have to fix it with the community. And then once you finally have it fixed with the community, then you can be accepted back in, and you realize that you're back in that community, and now you have a better understanding of how your decisions are made. When you come out of a criminal justice system, most of the time you feel like a victim. I got this, I was told this is what I had to do, I have to see my probation officer. You have no say in it. Where the RJ program, you learn and you work towards being accepted. It's huge. At the Longmont Police Department, it's very accepted in the administrative level. There are officers that aren't that familiar with the process that have the same mindset that I had when I started. And they're learning and they're growing, because this is new. This is a concept, if you're new to Longmont, is very new to you.
Virtually everybody that comes in the system, even if they're sentenced to prison or to jail, will be back in the community before very long. And so part of the challenge is for us to make sure they're back in the community as healthy as they can be, that they're not back in the community angry, with issues unresolved, and with a lack of resolution. And again, RJ provides an opportunity to be as healing as possible. And that's been very rewarding to watch.
One of the reasons why the criminal justice system has such a high recidivism rate is that when people are found guilty or potentially not guilty, that people did not, they were either, accountability was either forced or demanded or at some level legislated. And in our minds, that has very little sustainability in terms of the traction and impact it has on an offender's psyche. And so perhaps that's one reason why the recidivism rate is so high.
I do RJ because it makes me feel better about myself, and it makes me feel like I'm actually changing our community and helping kids in my school, and it feels good.
The changes that I've actually seen in Peter is he's a little more sensitive, to people around him. He can pick up on things that maybe he was a little more closed off to before. He was less irrational. He's less, the ability for him to be, take things out of proportion or something have been alleviated. He seemed to find a common ground within himself. His self-esteem, his self-confidence has grown in huge strides.
I want to use RJ as a psychologist. I want to use RJ in methods of psychology. I want to become a children and family therapist one day, and so I can use those skills. If there's a problem within the family and it's affecting the whole family, I want to do it in a way that every voice is being heard. Just like in restorative justice, every voice gets to speak and be heard. And that's what I see myself doing in some ways, using some of the skills that I've learned from restorative justice into when I become a future therapist, use some of those skills.
As a school resource officer, I have a five-year commitment, and then I can stay for 5 more years after that. So I'm finished up my 5th year. I got 5 more years. Is this a good career move for me? This is a good life move for me. I've been able to, as a father, change my approach of discipline with my children from a punitive, which I grew up as, is what I knew. I've been able to employ the restorative languages with conversations I have with people, both within the criminal justice system, within my personal life, within my personal relationships that I have. So career move, probably a good career move, but more importantly, it was an outstanding life move for me.
You know, I think when it comes to restorative practices and principles, I think it does have the capacity, it has the potential to change relationships, to change how people interact with each other. As I talked about before, developing a restorative community, developing a restorative country, a Department of Restorative Justice. I also think that these are the kinds of practices and principles that you don't necessarily need a nonprofit like the Longmont Community Justice Partnership to help with. We need them for our criminal cases, and we also need them in certain kinds of other circumstances. But it's a practice, it's an art, it's a science, it's a way of how we are with each other that can be trained and learned by anybody. And as I said, can change the way you see your family and how you react and respond. And so it has the overall potential for huge change.
As far as the community being let down, I don't think they were let down. How the community feels is, make it sound like a person, but that's the way, you can't do anything about that. And maybe that's what I've learned, is the community is going to feel the way that they're going to feel. But I feel strongly, and the cemetery staff feels strongly, that we did not let the community down, that this was the right way to do this. And for the most part, anyone that I have a one-on-one relationship with or know are very kind and complimentary about the work that we've done to deal with this issue. Most of the negative still comes from what you read in the comment section of the online Times call, which I should really stop reading. Even though there's been a time impact on me, as I earlier said, we're really pleased with the now community reaction, that they really do care about the cemetery. So maybe we as the cemetery can use some of that energy and love about the cemetery to do other things to make it a better cemetery.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. How precious did that grace appear the hour I first believed. Through many dangers, toils, and snares, I have already come. 'Tis grace that brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, was blind.